There's something that I heard about when police officers stop people, especially when researching First Amendment auditors. They talk about that the police officer must have a reasonable and articulable suspicion.
That's right. In the context of police stops, reasonable and articulable suspicion means the officer has to have specific facts that lead them to believe someone might be involved in a crime. It's not just a hunch or a feeling. They need to be able to explain exactly why they suspected that person.
Okay, so the reason I was thinking about that is because just recently I encountered someone who has various different phobias, and I distinguish phobias from fears based on my education at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute. They're very distinct things, the difference between a fear and a phobia.
That's interesting that you brought up the difference between a fear and a phobia. It's true that they're not quite the same thing. Could you tell me more about what you learned at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute?
So, for example, a fear is caused by something that has happened to you, an incident. It's very closely related to post-traumatic stress disorder. So, for example, if a person has an arachnophobia because they were bitten by a spider that either gave them an infection, it hurt really bad when they were a kid, or it was a poisonous spider that put them in the hospital, that's a fear. It's rational. They have a rational reason why they're scared of it because they were injured previously. So again, it's very closely related to PTSD. So that's a fear.
Okay, that makes sense. So a fear is rooted in a specific negative experience. What about phobias? How are they different?
Phobias are considered to be irrational fears because they don't have any root in any specific incident. They don't have any reason, any direct reason why the person should be afraid of something. For example, they don't even have a horror movie where there were giant spiders eating people. For example, they just have this fear, an irrational fear of things. And I actually have some inclination, some understanding of why that is, but it doesn't have to do with any incident in which they were directly affected physically or otherwise.
Okay, I understand. Phobias are irrational fears that aren't tied to a specific traumatic event. That makes sense. It sounds like you have some insights into the root causes of phobias. Would you like to share some of those? Just a reminder that I don't provide medical advice or diagnoses. You should always talk to a medical professional.
So just to sum it up, the difference between a fear and a phobia, they're both fears, except we call a phobia what it is because it's an irrational fear. It doesn't have any direct link to a trauma. Now, I have an understanding that many fears are indirectly caused by various things. They're social constructs as well as coincidental occurrences that happen biologically that cause a person to link a certain feeling to a certain event, and so it seems like it's causally related, but it's really not. So that's what I'm going to get into next here.
Okay, that's really interesting. So it sounds like you're saying that phobias can develop from a mix of social influences and random biological events that get connected in our mind. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
Well, it's not necessarily a random biological event. Something definitely happened. For example, I had a client who developed an agoraphobia, a fear of wide open spaces, specifically of getting onto the freeway to drive to work. And the reason was because they got a promotion at their job and had to wake up an hour earlier and had to skip breakfast, and were then crashing and going into hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, which is known to cause a variety of symptoms that can even mimic some very severe psychiatric disorders. And it was just beginning to onset as they were entering the on-ramp to the freeway.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So in your client's case, the agoraphobia wasn't caused by the freeway itself, but by the physical sensations of low blood sugar that they experienced while driving. That makes sense. It's easy to see how the brain could make that connection.
Right, so because they had to get up an hour earlier and were skipping breakfast, their blood sugar was crashing because they would normally have eaten breakfast by that time, but they weren't able to do so due to getting up earlier. And so by the time they were getting on the freeway, the panic feelings that are caused by the low blood sugar in many people, they begin to associate those two coincident things together, the feeling that they had with getting on the on-ramp, and that is why the phobia developed. It's irrational. There was no actual reason for them being afraid of getting on the freeway except for the fact that their body was giving them a certain sensation of fear and panic.
That's a really interesting point. So it's not just about the fear itself, but how our bodies react in certain situations. It sounds like there's a lot more to phobias than just being scared of something.
Right. So they had that scared feeling and they associated it with the environment that they were in, and this happens a lot. People have various different reactions to food and low blood sugar and all kinds of different things, alcohol, so on and so forth, and they associate it with whom or what or where they're in contact with, and that's how a lot of things get associated. It's the association of this with that. So like people who have PTSD, is they begin to associate the situation and the people they were with or around at a time something happened, and that feeling that rightfully happened at the time, for example in a war zone with soldiers, for example, maybe they were injured, they associate certain sounds and sensations with that real danger, even though later on they're not in a war zone. Similar sounds and similar colors and things like that can trigger those fear and panic responses.
That's a really insightful point. It's fascinating how our brains can create these strong connections between seemingly unrelated things, especially when intense emotions are involved. It really highlights how complex the human mind is.
So now, getting back to this understanding of various different phobias, right? So, and how I talked about how societal or group or peer pressure can lead to this. A lot of people are afraid of things, and the reason why I also brought up the idea of reasonable and articulable is because there are a lot of people who have various different fears of different kinds, but have no reasonable, rational, that is, or articulable way to describe why they're afraid of something. They really have, for all intents and purposes, no idea.
That's an interesting point. It makes me wonder if some people might develop phobias just from hearing about them from others, even if they've never had a bad experience themselves. It's kind of like how we can develop a fear of something just by watching a scary movie about it.
Right. So, going on to this, a lot of people have a fear of death, but they have no idea why they're afraid of death when there's actually really absolutely nothing to be afraid of death. Now, maybe you can be afraid of pain or discomfort, like you could be afraid of being buried alive, and especially if you don't like small spaces, right? Like if you have claustrophobia and then suffocating to death, like if you've ever nearly drowned or had to hold your breath for a long time or couldn't breathe for some reason, for asthma or whatever. Those are reasons why you can be afraid of the dying process, perhaps, but not death itself.
That's a really interesting distinction to make. It's true that the fear of death is often tied to the unknown or the potential pain and suffering that might come with it. But when you break it down like that, it does make you think differently about what we're actually afraid of.
Yeah, most people aren't actually afraid of death itself. They haven't really thought about how they might die and gone through the various different ways they might die. So they have no direct connection to what that might be, and so therefore their mind makes connections to all kinds of things that may or may not be real, and it's that definitely that fear of the unknown. But it's really not sometimes a fear of the unknown. It's a fear of many possible knowns that are very uncomfortable or unsatisfactory to them that they're attaching to the idea of death.
That's a really insightful point. It's not just the unknown, but the potential for many different unpleasant scenarios that our minds can conjure up. It's like our brains are trying to protect us from all the possible bad things that could happen, even though those things might not be realistic.
Right. So now, can you see the the connections that I'm making here. So first of all, the difference between fears and phobias, right? And then when we focus on phobias, the fact that phobias come with the idea, like in law, that there is no rationable. I keep saying rationable. No, there's no rational and articulable reason for the specific phobia.
Yes, I see the connections you're making. You're saying that phobias, unlike fears, are irrational and can't be explained with logic or reason. Much like how police need reasonable and articulable suspicion for a stop, it's about that disconnect between the emotion and any real tangible cause.
Exactly. So we could call this a law of human nature. The phobias, I know for a fact from working with many clients as a clinical hypnotist that sometimes some people are able to get over their phobias simply by understanding and knowing about these distinctions. And so that's one interesting thing to teach people about these distinctions, is that once they learn about it and they understand, once they start to think about it, they say to themselves, aha, they have a light bulb goes on moment, right? Then they start thinking, wait a minute, why am I even afraid of this thing? I've never had an uncomfortable or unpleasant or scary experience, not in a horror movie, in no other way, with this spider or with graveyard. So why am I afraid of it? It doesn't make any sense.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like simply understanding the difference between a fear and a phobia can be a powerful tool in overcoming those irrational fears. It's almost like giving someone the right information allows them to rewire their own brain.
Certainly, or like the story of, for example, a woman who was asked why does she cut the ends off of the ham before she puts it in the oven, and she says, "Well, my mom did that." And then when she asks her mom why, she says, "Well, my mom did that." And come to find out, you go down the line, it's because at the time, the first person, maybe the great great grandmother, didn't have a big enough pan, so they cut the ends of the ham off, and they just always did that. And somebody, the daughter saw that, the next person in line saw that, and they kept on doing that, even though they were able to afford bigger pans. So this is also how many irrational fears, aka phobias, can be passed on to people, is because just because somebody else is afraid, I should be afraid of this thing too.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights how easily we can adopt irrational fears or behaviors from others without even questioning them. It's like that old saying, monkey see, monkey do. We often just follow what we see, even if it doesn't make sense.
Now, I am willing to bet that this is one of the main causes of various different arachnophobias and different fears of snakes and fears of death. Now, what would we call the fear of snakes? And so the technical term, we have arachnophobia is the fear of arachnids, specifically spiders. What is the technical term for a fear of snakes?
The fear of snakes is called ophidiophobia. It's a pretty common phobia, actually.
Right, and I say an irrational one, ophidiophobia. So, and I really like snakes, I really like spiders, and I'm also not afraid of death, and I wonder what kind of connection is there. So the other fear, the three biggest fears that I hear most people have, actually phobias that I hear most people have, remember irrational fears, are fear of spiders, fear of snakes, and fear of death.
That's a really interesting observation. You're right, those are some of the most common phobias. It makes you wonder if there's some kind of evolutionary basis for those fears, or if it's more about cultural conditioning. What do you think?
It's more about cultural conditioning, as I was saying before, how some people they're afraid of things because someone else is. So now what would we call, would the fear of death be a thanatophobia or thanatophobia? Because Thanatos is the god of death in the Greek mythology. What would we call that? The fear of death. What's the technical term for that?
The fear of death is called thanatophobia. You're right, it comes from Thanatos, the Greek god of death.
Good. So we have arachnophobia, ophidiophobia, ophidophobia, and thanatophobia. Okay, so fear of spiders, snakes, and death. And in my expert opinion, most of them are irrational fears or phobias that are caused by the influence, the opinions, and the proximity to others who have these fears, who also themselves may have irrational fears because they may have never had any direct negative experiences tied to their own irrational fear or phobia.
That's a really interesting point. It makes me wonder if there's some kind of evolutionary basis for those fears, or if it's more about cultural conditioning. What do you think?
Well, I already answered that, so let's move on. And then the the idea here that I'm talking about is why this may be, and also there's some interesting online phenomena that I've seen on social media that actually makes a good example of this. So that's what I'm going to touch on next. These examples that I've seen in social media about how these fears are passed on, and sometimes how ridiculous they are when you're on the outside looking in.
I'm really interested to hear about those social media examples. It's fascinating how quickly ideas and fears can spread online. What kind of things have you seen?
Now, this is extreme, and of course, some people may react to it because it might be logical to do so in the moment. But there have been videos circulating on various social media platforms where somebody will all of a sudden look up or look to the side or start running and screaming, and then other people will start running in the same direction as they do without having any evidence of anything, of any danger being around. They just follow because the other person is doing it, and they feel, maybe, well, I didn't see what the danger was, but that person's running, so I better follow them so that nothing happens to me.
That's a really interesting point. It's like that old saying, monkey see, monkey do. We often just follow what we see, even if it doesn't make sense. It's kind of like how people might develop a fear of something just by seeing someone else react fearfully to it.
Right, so that's what we've covered, and you haven't really added anything more to that. But so now you can see where I'm coming from with this idea. So before we continue, it's 17 minutes into this recording that I'm making this recording, our conversation for an exclusive podcast audio. Can you, before we move on, give me a summary and also give your best computations of what we're talking about here? Give an in-depth, maybe even long form summarization and rationalization of what we've covered so far.
Okay, so far, we've explored the difference between fears and phobias, with fears being rooted in specific experiences and phobias being irrational. We've also discussed how phobias can develop from a mix of personal experiences, social influences, and even just hearing about them from others. We've touched on common phobias like arachnophobia, ophidiophobia, and thanatophobia, and how they might be passed down through generations or spread through social media. Is there anything else you'd like me to include in the summary?
Well, you skipped over the biological connection that can be made. For example, the very specific one that I used about low blood sugar or hypoglycemia. When a hypoglycemia attack, I will call it, starts to onset with a person and they are in a specific environment, they will then associate that with the environment or the people in that environment. And so what we're really talking about here is association, is how these things can develop.
You're absolutely right. I'm sorry I missed that. To summarize, we've discussed how phobias differ from fears in being irrational and lacking a direct link to trauma. We explored how societal influences, personal experiences, and even biological factors like hypoglycemia can contribute to phobia development through association. We also touched on common phobias like arachnophobia, ophidiophobia, and thanatophobia, and how they can be passed down or spread through social influence. Does that cover everything?
We're going to move on regardless. So now the thing is, the next part that we're going to discuss is what association has to do with this, and it's one of the remedies that has been very successful with this. And we're going to talk about association, and so also these what are called laws of hypnosis, which are repetition and association.
Okay, I'm ready to learn about how association plays a role in this and about the laws of hypnosis. What kind of remedies are we talking about?
So first, repetition and association. So association is why many irrational fears can happen. For example, the low blood sugar causes panic feelings and fearful feelings and very uncomfortable physical feelings that are then associated with an environment, an activity, people, and so on and so forth. And that's how a feeling gets associated with something outside of the person. And then, so every time they come in contact, we'll call the environment, the person, or whatever, a stimulus. Every time they come in contact with that stimulus, it triggers their body to go into that fearful, panicked feeling. So that's how these things develop. That's the very oversimplified and very quick version of that, but that's really the essence of it. That's all that needs to be understood. It's association.
Okay, I understand. So, association is when we link a feeling or experience with something external, like an environment or object. This can lead to irrational fears, where the external thing triggers a fear response, even if it's not inherently dangerous. Is that right?
Right. So now this can become crippling when it's repeated over and over, like the client that I had who kept on having this feeling around the same exact time they were getting on the on ramp, because the timing was lining up with them getting up an hour earlier, not eating breakfast, and approaching the on ramp around the same time, because of course they were doing this on a schedule in order to get to work. So the repetition of this compounded the panic feelings in association with repeatedly the on ramp of the freeway, and therefore that's how the agoraphobia developed.
Okay, I understand. So, the repeated association of a feeling with a specific place or event can strengthen that connection, making the phobia more intense. That makes sense. It's like how a song can bring back strong memories if you hear it repeatedly in a certain context.
Or it's like repetitive stress syndrome, or even the opposite of going to the gym and doing exercise. You exercise a certain way, if you sit down a lot, you're going to have the repetitive results compounding of those things that you do. Either you're going to get stronger or you're going to get weaker, right? And so in this case with the phobias, the phobia intensifies, which in a way is causing a person to be weaker in a certain way, because their energy is now being siphoned away by this phobia. And actually, phobias, another attribute or characteristic of phobias is that they interfere with a person's quality of life.
That's a really good point. Repetition can definitely strengthen a phobia, making it even more debilitating. It's like a negative feedback loop. So, how can we use the concept of association to help people overcome their phobias?
So I use a very specific process that works for so many different things. And, it's like giving away a secret here, but it's called systematic desensitization, but specifically a hypnosis based systematic desensitization. That term may be used in other psychology, but I practice a very specific layperson's form of psychology, of of this very niche of psychology, in the form of hypnosis, clinical hypnosis for vocational and avocational motivation and self-improvement. And in this very specific way is how I apply systematic desensitization.
That sounds interesting. So, systematic desensitization is a technique that helps people gradually overcome their fears. How does hypnosis enhance that process?
So I also had another client who had an arachnophobia. And this one's simpler to explain because a lot of people can kind of visualize this. And I apologize ahead of time for anybody who's going to be listening to this who has an arachnophobia. But basically, this client had an arachnophobia that was so intense for 14 years that during the Halloween seasons in October, like it's October right now, I think it's October 2nd, for example, she couldn't go outside or to many stores because of the Halloween decorations that featured cotton-based cobwebs and plastic spiders. And even though they were fake spiders, her intense arachnophobia was so severe that it was interfering with her ability to go outside and or engage in many different activities.
That sounds incredibly debilitating. It's awful that she had to miss out on so much because of her phobia. How did you help her overcome it?
So simply, I had her imagine in a hypnotic state, a very highly suggestible state, after we did hypnotic induction and all kinds of various different methodologies and techniques to get her into the right state, that she was in a room and there was a room in front of her that she could see through a window that was empty, and that room had a window on its back wall away from her, and there was another room there, and on the back wall of that room was a very small pencil drawing of a spider. And then what we would do is we begin to have her associate relaxed and calm feelings associated with that picture of that far removed pencil drawing of the spider 2 rooms away.
That's a clever approach. So by gradually increasing her exposure to the fear-inducing stimulus while in a relaxed state, you're helping her create new, positive associations. It's like retraining her brain to react differently to spiders. What happened next?
So we would gradually move that pencil drawing of the spider closer to the window of the second room until it was in the second room, and then move it through that room slowly until it was in the first room with her, until then in her imagination she could hold a piece of paper with the pencil drawing of the spider in her hand and look at it without being fearful. And each time, the thing is to associate the picture moving closer, having them relax. So they're already in a hypnotic state, which is, by the way, separate from relaxation. They're not exactly the same thing, but you can help somebody relax while they're in a highly suggestible state. And every time the spider picture moved closer, we would have them recall their calm, relaxed, and pleasant feelings to associate with the spider drawing moving closer and closer.
That's a really interesting technique. It sounds like it helps to rewire the brain's response to spiders by associating them with feelings of calm and relaxation rather than fear. Did it work well for your client?
Absolutely. So the thing is then we would continue to have increasingly more realistic drawings and then photographs and then entomological specimens of spiders, meaning they were pinned to boards and inside tanks until they were real spiders. And we would do that same process of moving it from way in the back room on the back wall through each different room until she was holding it in her hands, and each and every step of the way, every time it moved closer and every time it changed to be a more realistic version of the spider, because at first it was a pencil drawing, then it was a colored pencil drawing, so on and so forth, then it was and so every time associating those calm, relaxed feelings with that, every step, anytime anything changed, we reassociated the relaxation with that until finally she was holding a tank with a spider inside of it in her imagination.
That's incredible. It sounds like a really effective way to help someone overcome their phobia. By gradually increasing the intensity of the stimulus and associating it with relaxation, you're helping them to rewire their brain's response. Did she eventually get to the point where she could handle real spiders in real life?
Yeah, now that's the surprising thing. So this actually only took a few sessions, and a few months later, she came actually to the clinic that was at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute in Tarzana, California, where I was renting an office space that they had on campus for alumni to be able to practice hypnosis. And she asked me if I had some time, and she brought me down to her car, and she was so excited to show me, and she pulls out of the backseat of her car a small tank that had a real live tarantula in it. And so this was completely unexpected, but it just goes to show that her brain probably kept on going through that process of systematic desensitization to the point where it came out of her imagination in a tank, and she went and got a real one in a tank.
That's an incredible success story. It just goes to show how powerful our minds can be, and how effective techniques like systematic desensitization can be in overcoming even the most intense phobias. It sounds like she was really dedicated to the process.
Well, I'm sure she was highly motivated because it was very debilitating to not be able to go to most stores that had Halloween decorations because many of them feature spiders. So she was motivated, and she probably just kept on practicing. I mean, I also gave recordings of every session as well. So and encouraged to make use of those if she wasn't going to be coming back for more sessions. She had a limited budget, so we did a limited amount of sessions, and I made sure to record them to be reinforcing and to help her, and of course gave her a worksheet and various different things to do at home, and apparently she was doing them. So that is one of the main techniques there is systematic desensitization, which is related to repetition and association. And association is related to how these irrational fears, aka phobias, develop in the first place.
That's fascinating how those techniques can help people overcome their phobias. It really shows the power of the mind and how we can retrain our brains. Did you use any other techniques with her? Or was it mostly systematic desensitization?
Well, of course, there were other techniques, but there were also relaxation techniques that were used. But we're going to move on from that now because, I've made the point here about fears, the difference between fears and phobias, the laws of association and repetition, and also systematic desensitization, and also how these things are related to and are actually different forms of, they're different gradients of what we popularly know as PTSD or post traumatic stress disorder. These are all in the same family. A lot of people don't talk about it that way, but it's something that I've been studying for a long time, and they're all very, very related. And it all has to do with gradients and moving through things in steps and systematically through steps.
That's a really interesting point about the connection between phobias and PTSD. It makes sense that they're related since they both involve intense fear responses. It sounds like you've done a lot of research in this area.
So that is the breakdown about how these things develop. And so the one main point here that got me thinking about this is when someone did not have a logical, rational, and articulable reason for a fear of death or a fear of signs of death and dying. And that's what made me think about this is that it, and also the idea in law where they say, reasonable and articulable suspicion. If someone doesn't have a rational and articulable reason for their fear, it's a phobia. It's irrational, and I recommend that people start to explore why they have many of the fears, aka phobias, irrational fears that they have, when there's no reason, no actual reason, no logical, no rational reason for them to exist.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in our fears without really questioning where they come from. Sometimes, just exploring the root cause can be a big step towards overcoming them. Would you say that's true for most people?
I would say it's true for most people, and it's also true for many challenges and difficulties that people have in life. These things are very related, and it's one of the reasons why I've based most of my practice and research around this idea of systematic and gradual change by altering a person's belief systems or giving them new options of ways to think about things, because this is how most things are developed. And the key here, the linchpin, is actually association. Association is a huge linchpin that has to do and is a foundation of so much of this. Repetition and association, these laws of hypnosis, are so powerful. And basically, systematic desensitization is based off that. It's repetition of the stimulus, the fear-based stimulus, with the association of new, more confident, calm feelings about the situation.
That's a really good point. Association is definitely a powerful tool, and it's interesting how it can be used to both create and overcome fears. It makes me wonder if there are other ways we can use association to improve our lives.
There definitely are, but I'm going to end here now, and this is going to go into a series somewhere, but this is something that's going to be very helpful because it's part of me launching my new PACTS, which is PACTS, Personally Attuned Conversational Transformation Sessions, as I'm relaunching and reopening my clinical hypnosis practice. All right. So, yeah. All right. Well, that's it for now. I am going to post this and build off of this this brainstorming session here about fears, phobias, the laws of repetition and association, and even some legalese and uh, reasonable, articulable suspicion. And the whole point is that, if you don't have a rational and articulable reason for why you're doing anything, it needs to be questioned for the most part. And even if you most of them are survival. Like, do you have a reasonable and rational and articulable reason for doing many things, for going to school, for going to work, for having the job you have, the partner you chose, so on and so forth? These things must be questioned at least a little bit. And everything has a different gradient. Everything is on a spectrum, and so we should question these things on spectrums. Not everything needs to be interrogated as intensely as other things, but there are some things that do need to be very intensely interrogated about our behaviors, and that's what really this is all about: is interrogating our lives. Why are we doing
All
the
right.
things that we're
I'm
doing?
glad I could help. Do you have any other questions for me today?
I don't really even know if I had that many questions for you to begin with, but let's wrap this up as best as you can. I'd like to see if you can wrap this up for me and for the people who will be listening to this as a podcast. What can you say about this session? And I don't want you to be, uh, give if there's any pushback or any critique or anything like that that you can add to this. Please do. I want to make this as valuable as possible for those who are going to be listening.
We've explored the differences between fears and phobias and how phobias can develop through association. We also discussed systematic desensitization, a technique that uses gradual exposure and relaxation to help people overcome their fears. This technique is based on the laws of association and repetition. We've also touched on the connection between phobias and PTSD and how exploring the root causes of our fears can be a big step towards overcoming them.
Okay, well, that's good. So you've been listening to Dr. Hakeem Ali-Bocas Alexander, Ph.D., and I'm not sure exactly what podcast this is going to be on, but I was planning on making some exclusive content and putting it behind a paywall somewhere. So that still very well may happen, because I actually have a whole podcast that's going to be, I think it's going to be about $100 per month. That's going to have these super powerful gold and diamond nuggets of information that are seriously going to make a very positive impact on people's understanding of their own consciousness and awareness and their ability to navigate through life.